Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this month's Solutions of Change monthly mental health moment. This month we are talking about the idea of communication and getting your point across. So we recognize that there are a lot of difficulties that people have when they're communicating, and a lot of times it really is getting your point across. So I'm here with the wonderful Miss Charmaine Fobbs, and we are going to have a conversation about communication.
Give me your take.
So my take on communication is that it's difficult.
Okay.
It's difficult because each of us is dealing with our own stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you find yourself in a moment of anger or distress, that it may come out in the way that you speak, even if that's not what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my take.
That's your take.
It's difficult, but it can be done.
My take on communication is, say for instance, your husband comes home and he's not ready to communicate, and you know he's had a bad day,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just ready to speak on it. You need to make sure that it's a purposeful time and that you're actually ready to communicate, and just jump instead of just jumping right on top of the discussion just because you feel that it needs to be said.
Somebody needs to hear that. Because this is something that couples have difficulty with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing when the appropriate time is to talk about a serious issue.
Yes.
So you think about when somebody comes home from work, you don't know what happened during their day,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a lot of people need that space to decompress before they can move into anything else. And those are creating ground rules in relationships that help with communication. So if I come home after work and I say, just in general, give me an hour to
Mm-hmm.
decompress. And then as a partner in this relationship, I know that when you come home, I'm going to give you that time. And if it's something serious, then I'm going to let you know that it's something serious that we need to talk about, so that you can be somewhat prepared for a serious conversation.
And I agree completely. Another thing I would say would just active listening,
Mm-hmm.
being ready to actually hear what the person is saying and understanding what they're saying. And if you're not actively listening, then what are you going to hear?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. And how are you going to understand it? There's no way.
So you're saying that when I'm trying to talk to you about something important and you're on your phone, looking to the side, that's probably not a good thing.
Exactly. Not at all. Not at all. Because
Okay.
how can you get that understanding if your focus and your attention is somewhere else?
Right. And I think that kind of leads into the idea of how we communicate with our children, right? And we know that parents have difficulties when it comes to communication with their children. So when we're thinking about active listening with our children, what do you think are what do you think is some good advice to give parents when it comes to not only actively listening to their children, but also making sure that there's a connection there where their children can actively listen to them?
I think it goes back to finding that space, knowing that, okay, is this a good time to communicate? And whether it's a good time or not to communicate, can we actually communicate to them in a way where we're being sensitive towards
Mm-hmm.
the situation? And just sitting down and listening to them, having that ear to hear and not to just speak back and yell or whatever the case may be.
Right. And because we know that in communication, yelling does not get your point across.
Oh, no.
Right. And in most cases, when people start to yell, what they hear is, what the other person hears is that anger.
Yes.
Right. They don't hear what you're saying. They can't. There becomes a need to be defensive.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so your approach is going to cause someone to be defensive when it doesn't have to. One of the things that I recommend for families, and this is something that I feel like works well, is to create a space for family meetings where once a week or maybe every 2 weeks you have time to sit down with each other and just talk. It is a free and safe space that allows you to communicate to your children what it is that you're trying to get across, but also allows them to communicate to you. And sometimes as parents, we don't like to hear what our kids have to say.
Exactly.
But it's important that we do hear what they have to say,
Mm-hmm.
because if we're trying to create these functional relationships that work, it has to be two-sided. It can't just be, the way that some of us were raised, my way or the highway,
Yeah.
because then we end up with resentment and ideas of who we wished our parents were and how we wished our parents thought or taught us. So creating that space for open, honest communication is really effective when it comes to families.
Completely.
What do you think are some of the pitfalls that we run into when it comes to communication?
Oh, some of the pitfalls, I would say, just the way that we convey our words.
Okay.
Like, say, for instance, if I'm just sitting there saying, you did this, you did that, you didn't, listen to me, or you didn't come home on time, that means you don't love me. Using that word you in all of your messages instead of that I will allow them to understand that, okay, I have feelings.
Yes.
And they would be less resentful of what you're trying to indicate or convey.
I statements. I statements are huge. In any space, and this is whether it's in your relationship or professionally or wherever it is, using an I statement lets the person know that their action or their thought process or whatever it is made you feel some type of way. So instead of saying, you make me so mad when you do this, I can say that I get upset when I feel like you're not paying attention to me. And so now I'm not putting the onus on you, but I'm letting you know that there's something that you're doing or saying that makes me feel a certain way. And the goal is that if you care enough about me, that you'll hear what I say and make adjustments in a way that makes our relationship more functional.
So what I'm hearing is just being empathetic at the same time.
Yes.
And once the person feels heard and understood and that you care, then that's when you can move forward in that effectiveness in communication.
And sometimes that's just what it is, right? We're looking for somebody to hear us. Now, I'm not asking you to change your whole life because I'm upset about one thing or another. I just want you to hear me and understand that there's something that bothers me. And if I'm important to you, that means something to you, right? Right. Outside of the I statements, what are some other tips that we can give when it comes to communication?
Some other tips I would say is actually, again, I'm going to just reiterate, is finding that space. Secondly, active listening. Third, being aware of how you're conveying what you're conveying.
Okay.
Make sure that you understand that it's not just about you being heard. Make sure you're hearing the other person as well and understanding them. Right. And gaining that understanding. And then after that, just realizing that there's more to it than just the verbal part of communication. Right. That's where the nonverbal comes in. Pay attention to what you're saying, the tone in which you're saying it. And then also with the eye communication, the right amount of distance when you're speaking to the person. And then it goes into actually just being aware of your surroundings, being self-aware of yourself, right? Being self-aware. And if you can be self-aware and know that, okay, I'm looking the other way, or my body posture is off, and I'm sitting here leaning and turning away and just looking all kinds of ways. Right. You're not paying attention. So those are some things that I think, just pay attention to the verbals as well as the nonverbals.
And that's big. You think about if you are having a conversation with someone and they are, in your face or in your personal space, immediately your body reacts to that in some way. Like, is this danger? Wait a minute, why are you so close to me? I'm one of those people that talks a lot with my hands, and it's just because I'm expressive, but when I am in a serious conversation, I understand the impact that my hands have. Because if you're knife-handing somebody with I know you heard what I said, then you know that it's going to come across a certain kind of way. And then that person now has to react to that based on what their perspective is, because their perspective could be that every time they've had someone react to them in that way or speak to them in that way, then that means that there's a fight coming, right? And so in their mind, they're prepared for, okay, what's next? I don't hear anything that you're saying. I'm prepared for what's next.
It's an automatic shutdown.
Right, so we have to think about people's perspective. Another thing that I like to tell people, and this is what I call old school mama tip, number 19,471. Every time I give this tip, the number changes. But the content doesn't change because we need to make sure that we are thinking before we speak and act. Sometimes our thoughts can be dysfunctional, right? Sometimes our thoughts will tell us something that something's true when it's not. And so we want to make sure that we're exploring, doing a little self-evaluation before we create a conflict over something that maybe just be something that we perceive from our our personal perspective, right? So you think about things like, I know that when you're raising teenagers, a lot of things are difficult. When you're raising teenagers, you think about the idea that they're developing in a specific way, right? And they're creating their own thought processes and determining who it is that they're trying to be. Well, if we see their behaviors, whether it's, they're a little bit more chatty than they normally are, a little bit more back talk, or have something else to say. I have one of those kids that always has to have the last word, and he gets that from me, so I can't be too mad about it. But
same here.
But when you think about it, when we internalize that, right, when we turn it over in our heads and ask ourselves, is that a part of their development, becoming more of an assertive person, because that's what the example is that they have, right? So if you're thinking that you want your child to be assertive, I shouldn't say can't, because we can't tell people what they should do and what they shouldn't do, but it's important that we look at that and ask ourselves, am I getting upset because I feel like I'm being disrespected, or actually am I being disrespected, right? So if I feel like I'm being disrespected, then there may be a certain reaction. But it may just be that in this period of time, my teenager is showing me that they can be assertive. Now, assertive and respectful is another thing, right?
Oh, yes.
And so that's space for a lesson.
I love that.
So what do you think about the way that we sometimes perceive things and react to them before we think about what's really happening?
Sometimes the way that we perceive things could mean everything. Perception is everything. So that if you're not sitting back listening to the person and you have your own way of thinking, so you're already in your mind just going over, what am I going to say next?
What am I going to say next?
What's happening? And when you go from there, it's like, are you really, really paying attention? Because you're ready to fire back with what you think it is, instead of hearing that person out and just saying, okay, it may be a little bit different.
Right. I think you make a good point too, because this is something that, and I'm going to say it as a human being, I have the right to be guilty of this, that I've been guilty of before too. Preparing myself for a conversation and having expectations about how that conversation is going to go. I'm expecting that I'm going to go in and I'm going to say this, and I know I'm right, so their reaction is going to be this, and I'm ready for that too. I know what I'm going to say after that. And then go into this conversation and not have it go that way, and in your head you're like, no, I know what I'm going to say. But I didn't hear that they already apologized for the thing that I was upset about, because I'm ready with what I said I was going to say in the conversation. And so I think that's a big thing, and you make a great point by bringing that up. We need to sometimes get outside of our heads and really make sure that we're in that moment and connecting.
Yes, I agree.
We're thinking about communication, and we talked a little bit about some of the pitfalls that we've seen, some tips that we've seen. Is there anything else that you feel may be an important part of this idea of getting your point across?
I know that we've done a whole recap of certain things, but the most important, I would say, just listen. Listen to get an understanding.
Right.
That's the most important there.
And it's very cliche, and I'm sure that everybody's already heard it 1,000 times before, but if you have the ability to grow up with a grandma, you have heard God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so you can listen twice as hard and talk half as much. We're at a good place to kind of wrap up our conversation on communication and getting our point across. I want to say that we really can make a determination that we're going to communicate with one another. It's important that we remember that every person thinks differently. We have our own experiences and our own perspective, and maybe we don't get it the first time. That doesn't mean that you should give up trying to communicate with others. It just means that maybe it takes a little effort, but don't hesitate to try again.
Just remember that without effective communication skills, it's difficult to get your point across.
Thank you so much, Charmaine, for joining me this month for our Solutions of Change monthly mental health moment. I appreciate your insight, and I'm hoping that everyone can hear this message and understand that we all individually have the power to create better relationships through communication. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now you've heard us talk about communication and getting your point across, and you may be asking what's next. The first thing that we can do is explore communication breakdowns and needs, and that means we are assessing the way that we're communicating with others to see if there's a block that is causing them not to understand us or for us not to be clear with what it is that we're trying to get across. Secondly, you can utilize effective strategies and seek help. If you don't have the strategy, if you're trying to do the same thing over and over again and getting the same result, maybe you need assistance. So don't be afraid to seek help. Help seeking behaviors are some of the most important things that we can do to manage our mental health concerns, and communication can be a part of a mental health concern. And lastly, register and join us for our Solutions of Change monthly mental health moment group on December the 30th, 2021 from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. via Zoom. We look forward to seeing you and furthering the conversation about communication.